we're ready for our next session. This session will continue possibly the fluidity of the last session, but also bring about a little more ancient sort of structure within our discourse. And this session is on religion. It is my very proud privilege to welcome Mr. Komkap Montier Dugoto, who is affiliated with who is the convener of the World Affairs Journal, and this journal is affiliated with the Kapoor Surya Foundation. I also am delighted to invite Dr. Mujibur Rahman, who is an assistant professor at the Jamia Millia Islamia University, and our own Professor Maaz bin Bilal, who is one of the assistant professors at Jindal Global University. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, I can just start with a few comments about the few panels we had earlier, and we are going in depth in the meaning probably of forgiveness. Forgiveness in Italian is perdono, and perdono is a hyperbolic form of gift. So it requires a kind of very profound involvement and generosity and resourcefulness from individual itself. And in relation with, for instance, with the idea of literature, I was thinking about a beautiful page written by Primo Levi in The Drowned and the Saved, in relation with the idea of pain and suffering. And he says in this amazing page that what could not forgiven is the fact that the Nazis, the criminals, were introducing a form of pain, a form of suffering for the first time in the history. And this kind of pain could not be bared, could not be forgiven. So, and it's totally different from, for instance, for the ancient idea of forgiveness given by the Latins. They equate forgiveness with oblivion, so forgetting. So what can we do? Forgetting or remembering. If I can relate to what was the topic of the first panel, the idea of truth and reconciliation commission, the idea of truth telling, of re-going to that kind of pain, do you think that this can really heal a person? Actually, there are a lot of social research on this, especially in, focusing on Rwanda, and amazing human rights reports that says that actually the idea of re-going back to those days is something that re-traumatized the victims. So we have to take with very much care all these ideas and of equating truth and reconciliation. So we are going back now to religion, and if I think about religio and the idea of sacred is something that is separated. Religio means separated, and sacred means separated. So the idea of God is something that is not understandable. It's not for human being to understand fully. So let's see through them, actually, and I'm very curious about what is the idea of God and what is even the idea of forgiveness in the Hebraic tradition, in the probably Islamic tradition, and in other form of traditions. And what kind of relationship there could be between the individual form of forgiveness and what is the framework, the religious framework, the beliefs and the values that religions give people for in this kind of hyper gift. Because as Hannah Arendt said, she said that a beautiful thing that when you forgive one is like allowing himself to come back to life, because he's stuck in the guilt he is committed, and forgiving him is like giving him back the life and giving him back the possibility for playing again with life. So I will introduce you the first panelist, who is Professor Maaz bin Bilal, and we will talk about Hebraic God, and then I would like to invite Dr. Rahman as a second one, and the last one, Monsieur Carpentier de Gourdon. And yes, you can start, Maaz. Thank you.
Shall we speak from here or?
Yes.
Your choice.
If it's working.
This is easier, I think. Or is it fine? Maybe I should come here. I feel odd because people on the side won't be able to see me. Right. So thank you, Sylvia, for that. I had originally thought of the paper a little differently. I'd called it. I thought I'd speak on the Hebraic God, and I thought I'd speak of God from the Judaic, the Christian, and the Islamic traditions. But instead, due to various logistical demands, I've restricted the topic slightly, and I'm largely focusing on the Old Testament, and within that, Genesis mainly, and largely speaking of Christianity. And I've titled the paper slightly differently now. I've called it The Hebraic God and What He Never Forgives, a Case for Hospitality. It's going to be largely, so I'm a literature student, and I teach in the liberal arts school at Jindal, and so this is largely going to be a critical reading of the Bible. I'm not a Bible expert, I'm not a religious studies person, so pardon me if I make any mistakes here that are far too glaring and obvious. But anyway, and also one other caveat, so the paper in a larger sense owes a certain debt to Derrida, which I think I might as well acknowledge right at the start. Right, so the Hebraic God and What He Never Forgives, a Case for Hospitality. I'll begin by quoting from the book of Nahum, from the New International Version of the Bible. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is filled with wrath. The Lord takes vengeance on his foes and vents his wrath against his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. I seek not so much to probe the nature of this jealous and avenging God of the Bible, but to interrogate the nature of the actions of the guilty that he never leaves unpunished. What is the crime of the people that fills the Lord God with such wrath? In fact, what deserves the strongest of punishments at the hands of the Maker, who, as the book of Nahum goes on to tell us, rebukes the sea and dries it up, quaking mountains, melting hills away, and who pours out his wrath like fire and shatters rocks away. I argue in this paper by mainly analyzing Genesis to show that whatever the specific crime, the common underlying cause to enrage God is either the lack or the abuse of hospitality. This is the focus of the first part of my paper. In the second part, I try to argue, like some other recent writers, that holding on to the value inscribed by God on hospitality, how Europe and the West must be more hospitable in our own times towards refugees and strangers, especially as both spaces are increasingly more Christian than probably ever before in the last century. Isn't this then what the Lord God expects, and if shortchanged on, what he will never forgive? So to begin from the beginning, God creates heaven and earth, on it the Garden of Eden, wherein he places the first man, Adam. There he gives him a helpmeet, Eve, and of them he asks of nothing but to relish and bear witness upon his love and generosity and to partake of his hospitality. The one injunction is not to eat of the trees of knowledge. And here the first man and woman abuse God's hospitality, which is the original sin, and leads to their excommunication and much misery for the human race. It is this abuse that could not be forgiven, at least not immediately. And God alone, with his immense generosity, would later take birth as Christ and die to atone for it. The message seems quite clear. To abuse hospitality is the greatest sin, and yet there must be more hospitality, even limitless hospitality, and ever more generosity for the human race to go on. Forgiveness may not be possible immediately, but it must be given in time. Next, as the story goes, Adam and Eve bear sons, the firstborn children of the earth, Cain and Abel. However, amongst these first children of man, one lacks in the gestures of hospitality towards God. In the sacrifices both make to the Lord, Cain's offering is not true. It is not the best that he could have offered, and God chides him for it. In response, Cain gets jealous and commits the sin of fratricide that further induces the wrath of God who marks him for eternity and takes back his hospitality upon earth from him for killing his brother, his kin, his neighbor on earth. Cain may till the earth, but it would not yield to him any longer. He has no home, he is a vagabond and a fugitive. This is the greatest curse, to live without a home, to be in exile. Cain thinks it would be better to be killed. Next, Adam and Eve bear other children, beginning with Seth, and the earth is populated. But once more, abusing the hospitality offered by the earth, they suffuse it with evil, and God floods the planet to drown out all but Noah and his family, on whom he shows mercy. God expects true hospitality of Noah, whom he commands to build an ark on which he is to take in a pair of each species of the living. Nature and the human race are both afforded chances of survival on a boat sailing to safety, reminiscent of many scenes now seen upon the Mediterranean that our contemporary times put in front of us. Once the race of Noah settles and prospers again, there emerge corruption in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which the vengeful God cannot let go unpunished and decides to destroy as well. On Noah's pleading, he agrees to not do so if they can find 10 men who are not sinful. However, what is the unpardonable sin of Sodom, after all? Is it the sexual deviance that Orthodox criticism has us believe? Or is it the lack of hospitality that the citizens of Sodom show to the 2 angels sent there by God to find 10 good men? Recent pro-homosexual rights scholars in particular argue that it is the rapacious behavior shown by the citizens and the complete abandonment of all hospitality towards the strangers that brings down the wrath of God. Lot, who saves the angels, goes as far as to offer to the people of Sodom his own virgin daughters to be raped in exchange for the strangers, who are also maybe considered guests or who are really the angels, that he wishes to honor. He thus shows indomitable hospitality and is therefore saved by God when the city is destroyed. It is only those who bestow hospitality generously that deserve his grace. And such incidents abound in the Bible, and one can go on to show how almost all sins that meet the strictest punishments by the wrath of God can be interpreted to be either the abuse or the lack of hospitality shown by men. I will pick on a few more glaring examples just to add more meat to my argument. So from Genesis and then Exodus, we get the migrations of the Israelites, first to Egypt with Joseph and then back in the Exodus under Moses. As the Israelites are bonded into slavery in Egypt, God rains down the 10 plagues upon them, killing all the firstborns of all the Egyptian people. These Egyptians have forgone the earlier promise of hospitality afforded the Israelites, and the tyrannical Pharaoh is killed in the parting of the sea. Moses and his people migrate to safety as refugees who find newer and safer homes, the promised land, where they may now live freely. Thus, observing how the Hebraic people themselves have suffered through the abuses of hospitality and how God has avenged them, and how it pleases him for men to be hospitable, it must be considered incumbent upon Christians, perhaps more so than others, to be hospitable as well. Furthermore, the Hebraic people have often been migrants and refugees themselves, fleeing the wrath of God against others who may have displeased him, and they have done so by land and by sea. On these counts only must they not show hospitality towards other refugees who come to them today by land and by sea. Have the people of Jehovah not expected, received, and at times even forced people to offer hospitality by bringing with them what they claim as the wrath of God? In a negative sense, George Bush, of course, used the word crusade for his war on terror that he saw opposed to Western civilization, but by implication proved that the Christian civilization was moored quite definitely for not just the religious, but even the agnostic and the downright atheistic people of the West. David Cameron, in his canvassing for the elections that he won eventually, which had its culmination in Brexit, of course, then his rule. So he, in his canvassing for the elections, he said how he felt proud that this country, being Britain, proud that this is a Christian country. So in its holidays and its calls for nationalisms and other daily instances, the Christian nature of the West is apparent. Then following the word, the expectations, the wrath, and the revenge, as well as the ultimate forgiveness of the Hebraic God, is it not imperative upon the people and the Western governments to extend limitless hospitality to refugees from Syria and the Middle East who are knocking at Europe's borders, and especially when these are refugees who have been denied their safe lives, at least partially, by the involvement of the West? Giles Fraser, he's a priest in South London, he writes in The Guardian, he seems to agree with me. Fraser rhetorically asks, how many refugees can UK take in? His powerful response resounds strongly as it invokes the Bible. And I quote, why not all of them? Surely that's the biblical answer to the how many we can take question. Every single last one. Let's dig up the green belt, create new cities, turn our downtown abbeys into flats and church halls into temporary dormitories, and reclaim all those empty penthouses being used as nothing more than investment vehicles. Yes, it may change the character of this country, or maybe it won't require anything like such drastic action. Who knows? But let's do whatever it takes to open the door of welcome. But not all voices are as generous or even as accommodating. Peter Erdo, who is a Roman Catholic priest from Hungary, said in response to the church at Vienna sheltering refugees that if Hungarian churches sheltered refugees, they would be engaging in human trafficking. Perhaps a rereading of the Bible, such as I've tried to exhibit above, may help clear the minds of such as Peter Erdo. In these Derridian moves, I try to show how God, the Creator, the ultimate author, punishes most strongly with his wrath and avenges all slights on hospitality, both in receiving and offering it. He's the one who also offers the greatest forgiveness when he takes birth to atone for the original sin. Then should not his believers or upholders of his tradition afford the same hospitality and forgiveness to those in utmost need of it? How long can Syrian children drown in the Mediterranean? For the people of Israel, who often found themselves refugees of the world and took asylum in different parts, must it not be imperative to offer refuge? Rereading the Bible, where all revenge and forgiveness seems to hang on hospitality, may be one answer for the West. Thank you.
Yes, please, Dr. Rehman. We talk about revenge and forgiveness in the Hindu-Muslim relations in modern India. Yes.
Good afternoon to everybody. I am also not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian, I'm primarily a political scientist. So my primary purpose of joining this conference is to be part of Ramin's glamorous academic life in Delhi, India. So, and learn, then to share knowledge. So I've tried to use whatever little knowledge I have from political science in the context of Hindu-Muslim relations, trying to give some kind of spin to this whole analysis on the question of revenge and forgiveness. My primary question would be like this. Let me just try to lay out the framework in which I thought that there is a need to think about, and why we need to think about these notions. There is an assumption that there is a moral hierarchy of various kinds of human conduct, and forgiveness stands somewhere at the top, and revenge stands somewhere below that, quite below that. And we all aspire since we all aspire to be good human beings, so we should try to have certain practices of human conduct which are good and which are not good, and make that choice, and therefore. But to think that all of us would be forgiving is probably a very utopian concept, just as to think that everybody should be very revengeful could be quite catastrophic. So why should not everybody be revengeful? So individually, we all know that we are all going to die, but I think one of the primary commitment that we have, an understanding we have as human beings, that humanity must live on. The cycle of generations after generations must continue, preferably in a better manner, but it should continue. But we all realize that we are all imperfect human beings, and we do all kinds of things about it. I think one of the reasons why we need to discuss is precisely for our commitment to that continuity of humanity. Because if all become kind of revengeful, then it is possible that the humanity would extinct, and then no one would be around to discuss about this. So that is the framework in which I am kind of looking at this question because Hindu-Muslim question in the context of South Asia is the most prominent question in terms of what sort of South Asian society that is going to be built up. So one of the panelists said, forgiveness could be itself a revenge. So I would like to ask, what about revenge? Can revenge, it could also be a kind of forgiveness? And, we can keep on debating about that part of it. There are a lot of violence with respect between Hindus and Muslims in this country. We are not talking about Islam and Hinduism, we are talking about Hindus and Muslims. And in this experience of Hindus and Muslims, violence related to that, or the relationship that they had, there are cases of forgiveness and there are cases of revenge. And there are a lot of stories and almost all major violence that we have seen. I will begin with one. There is a very fascinating book by Mahatma Gandhi with the title called Revenge and Reconciliation, published sometime in the year of 1997, and where he ends the book from discussing it, narrating the life of Hamza Bhai. Hamza Bhai was a Muslim fellow who was 50-year-old when his son was stabbed during Mumbai riot. And then subsequently, when he visited his son in the hospital, his son gave the names of all the people who stabbed him, all the assailants, all the attackers. And Hamza Bhai had the list of names. When his relatives come and asked him, give the names of those people who did this to you, to your son, he did not give their names. And subsequently, when Rajmohan Gandhi met him at a conference in Ceylon, asked him, why didn't you give those names? So he said, I as a father has lost something and I didn't want other fathers to lose their sons about it. So we have similar stories in virtually in every major violence in this country where we'd come across extraordinary display of forgiveness and also extraordinary display of all kinds of revengeful activities. Now, let me preface this on the notion of forgiveness, about which I was kind of alluding. In Islam, where does the notion, how is this particular notion explained in Islam? And I just want to say this and then I kind of come to the main question, main narrative. Fatima Marnisis, who is kind of Simone de Beauvoir of Middle East, wrote this book called Islam and Democracy as a response to what happened to Middle East after First Gulf War, essentially asking many difficult questions to Arabs that what kind of onslaught that you're likely to face and what has happened to your Arab identity. She expressed a lot of concerns, and some of the concerns have turned out to be true when you look at Middle Eastern politics today. So in 1979, she did an interview with a black Muslim in Berkeley and was very curious to find out why this Californian was interested in embracing Islam. She found out that he had a Syrian friend who took him to a mosque in San Francisco on one Friday. And he said one of the reasons why he eventually decided to embrace Islam was because of the word called Rahma. That was the word, he said. That was the code. I searched for it for so long, and here it was. On that Friday, the Imam chose a particular text in his sermon from the verse, which read like this: Kataba Rabbukum alana fishi ala rahma. Your Lord hath prescribed for himself mercy. Surah 6 of, verse 54 of Holy Quran. So she analyzes that rahma is a very rich concept with multiple facets. It has sensitiveness, or al-rika, tenderness, al-tatuf, and also forgiveness, al-maghfira. It is everything that is sweet and tender, nourishing and safe, like a womb. Rahma has its roots in uterus, raham. Rain is rahma because it brings prosperity, al-khayar. The ummah, the mythic Muslim community, is overflowing with rahma, as is the relationship of love that links the members of a family and make each one concerned about the fate of others. So there is this notion of forgiveness that exists in Islam, but there is a very limited narrative or evidence of it that we come across when we look at literature about various Muslim states, their deeds or misdeeds, atrocities, and all that stuff of it. So that takes us to this bigger question concerning Hindus and Muslims in India. Hindu-Muslim relations in India, as many of you who are familiar with the contemporary trends of Indian politics, is likely to be conflict-ridden and violent. Because the politics of this country, as it is dictated with the Hindu right ideology, one gathers, and as I would read out from some sections of some of the writings of the thinkers of Hindu right ideology, that there is this desire to take revenge. Do Indian Muslims deserve all those varieties of revenge? Should they be forgiven? Or should they ask for forgiveness? If none of this happens, then where it would all lead to in terms of relationship? At the heart of this evolving conflict-ridden relationship between Hindu and Muslims lay the notion of revenge by the Hindu right towards Indian Muslims, seen by them largely as outsiders, invaders, disloyal, and violent people. This perception about Muslims is not confined to followers of Hindu right, rather is held by a vast majority of conservative Hindus. Most eloquently, this was expressed by Neeraj Chaudhary in the following words. "Nothing was natural for us," commented Chaudhary, "than to feel about Muslims in the way we did. We were told, even before we could read, that Muslims had ruled and oppressed the Hindus, spread their religion with the Quran in one hand and a sword in the other, abducted Hindu women, destroyed temples, and polluted sacred places. As we grew older, we read about the wars of Rajputs, Marathas, and the Sikhs against Muslims, and the intolerance and oppression of Aurangzeb. The reference to Lord Shivaji, Maharana Pratap by Prime Minister Modi in his speeches as the ideal king and their achievements and the glory is a reflection of a similar understanding of history and also of Muslim past. On the one hand, there are numerous treatises, writings on Hindu-Muslim intermingling on social and cultural fusion and on the commonality of inter-community interests. A wide range of liberal, eclectic, radical ideals and movements from Rajmohan Rai to Nehru have contributed to the growth of inter-community linkages. Some of them were expressed in the poems of Tagore and Iqbal and others. However, intellectual understanding of Indian Islam and its followers have been very sketchy, influenced by a majoritarian perspective. There were no serious interpretations of Islam in contemporary times, no counterparts of Al-Baruni or Amir Khusru or Abul Fazl or Dara Sikho in past few decades. In this context, M.N. Rai's critique in 1938 is worth recalling, in which he expressed surprise that Hindu Muslims who have lived together for so many centuries did not appreciate each other's culture and religion, that educated Hindu were blissfully ignorant of the immense revolutionary significance of Islam. So we have these two contrasting perspectives. One, there is an attempt to understand and share, and then there is an attempt where there is the justification for revenge and violence. And the later takes place primarily because the later kind of understanding where revenge is there is primarily the interpretation of history. Because understanding of Indian Muslims is essentially based in a manner that the Muslim states or Muslim rulers have ruled this country and the kind of legacies that they have left. That is precisely the reason how people look at it. They don't look at average Muslims during riots or violence, that they are average Muslims doing daily things, regular things. They see an Aurangzeb or a Babbar among those Muslims, and then they indulge in all those violent activities. Historians, however, have expressed deep discomfort with the kind of interpretation of Indian history or historiography, the kind of interpretation of historiography of India has been attempted. Progressive historians like Romila Thapar and others have argued that it was misleading to argue Muslim rule, the rule by Muslim rulers as Muslim rule, whereas we never make that kind of, we don't describe British rule as Christian rule. By doing that, we do a lot of injustice to our own historiography. The most fascinating distinction about this was done by Professor Mohammad Mujib, who wrote a very influential book considered to be classic on Indian Muslims in 1967 called Indian Muslims. And I'm just going to read it out. I have around 10 minutes? So this is what he argues. No Indian Muslim state was aimed at being a theocracy. It was Islamic only in the sense that ruler was a Muslim and the ruling party mainly Muslim. The glorifications of court historians notwithstanding, they were always religious-minded persons or groups who on principle avoided kings and courts, something by nature evil. Examples could be given of nature who were fanatical, but their fanaticism was a matter of personal disposition and not a policy commended by the Sharia of Islam. Aurangzeb to levy jizya, for instance, may be regarded as a measure necessitated by financial stringency or as an expression of fanaticism, but it is extremely doubtful if it could be justified on the grounds of Sharia. Unfortunately, Indian historians of today do not have the patience to study elements of Sharia for rulers, for themselves, and to examine independently statements in regard to Muslim rulers who committed acts of injustice or violence, claiming that they have fulfilled the injunctions of Sharia. As you're familiar, so then he draws a distinction where he makes the argument that Muslim rules in this country was not communal, even if there was a connection between masses and this, because they were essentially pursuing their own power ambitions without essentially thinking in terms of doing any benefit to that particular community. And he draws this distinction and says that a Rajput Hindu state was far more religious than Indian Muslim states, because Muslim states they were not a clan or a caste, they were different families at different points of time who were ruling different parts of India. Now let me just comment on a particular controversy concerning renaming of Aurangzeb Street Road in Delhi. How should we interpret it? Is it an attempt for revenge or fixing the history? Narayani Gupta, historian, she wrote out of frustration that any mishap could be blamed on Aurangzeb. Even a swarm of bees in a well in a Bihar village was confidently attributed by a little girl to Aurangzeb. He is like Kuttichatu of Malayalis, responsible for anything that went wrong. The question is this, that Aurangzeb has been presented as one of the most bigot, fundamentalist, fanatic ruler of Indian history. In a recent book by Andrei Trotsky, who wrote a book called Aurangzeb, the Man and the Myth, published just a few weeks ago, she tries to argue that Aurangzeb was a man of his own times. She brings attention to this particular fact, to this set of facts. Detractors trumpet that Aurangzeb destroyed certain temples without acknowledging that he also issued many orders protecting Hindu temples and granted stipends and land to Brahmins. They denounce that he restricted the celebration of Holi without mentioning that he also clamped down on Muharram and Eid festivities. They omit altogether that Aurangzeb consulted with Hindu ascetics on health matters, employed more Hindus in his administration than any prior Mughal ruler by a substantial margin. Between 1679 to 1707, when he passed away, Aurangzeb increased Hindu participation at the elite levels of the Mughal state by nearly 50%. Hindu rose to 31.6% of the Mughal nobility. So the point I'm interested to make is this: there is always this attempt to decontextualize various historical figures and historical personalities in order to justify certain revenge or certain forms of revenge. But those decontextualization does not take place in the context of others such as Shivaji or Maharana Pratap. When you glorify Shivaji and Maharana Pratap, we don't apply modern standards. We don't ask what was the position of Shivaji with regard to sati system, for instance. Was he a feminist? What was the position of Maharana Pratap with respect to caste? So if you are addressing modern society and trying to looking for a hero in your past, you should also use those notions and apply those same standards in order to write a good history. Since our history is so distorted, and that leads to all these kinds of narratives justifying or creating some sense of justification among the masses. So what we come across is this kind of slogans that Muslims are described as Babar Santan. In an important work by Vibhutinarayan Rai titled Hasimpura, where we had these famous custodial killings, he found out that when he was conducting his research, most people who were associated directly or indirectly with that custodial killing, they were saying Muslims must be taught a lesson. Then, of course, there are analyses of similar kind with respect to Gujarat violence in the writings of Harsmander and Siddhartha Vaidarajan. One of the most famous argument that reaction we often come across is this go to Pakistan abuse, which is exclusively for Indian Muslims, that if you're not good, you better go to Pakistan. Now, Hindu right has not updated about the political developments of South Asia. Pakistan, which they hate for whatever reasons, is no longer the Pakistan. The Pakistan is now divided into Pakistan and Bangladesh. So they don't abuse, go to Bangladesh. They say you go only to Pakistan, you know. So now let me just, how many minutes? 3 minutes. All right, just give me 4 minutes. Now it is very important for us to ask, then how should we then look at this? There are two aspects of it. One is this, who are Indian Muslims? How Muslims embraced Islam to become Muslims. There are several, historians haven't been able to come out with any conclusive explanation about that. There is an argument that Islam spread by sword. There is also an argument that people wanted to get out of caste atrocities, or they were really attracted to the somewhat egalitarian appeal of Islamic religion, and all that stuff of it. So there is also a perception that a large number of Indian Muslims were essentially, in few generations back, were Hindus. Now, if they were Hindus and there is a continuity in the religious line, then why would you like to be so angry and unleash all forms of revenge on them and describe them as outsider? Very interestingly, Hindu right there is a group who believes that that is true, that they were all Hindus, and there is evidence for it. For instance, even among famous people, Lajpat Rai's father, Lala Lajpat Rai's father, embraced Islam for a while. Gandhi's son embraced Islam for a while. You must be knowing about a very famous freedom fighter called Safiuddin Kichlu. There was a protest which led to that famous Jallianwala Bagh massacre. His grandfather, Prakash Ram Kichlu, was a Hindu. So there are plenty of evidence. M.J. Akbar's immediate family 2 generations ago were Hindus. So there is this continuity about it. So obviously, there are 2 opinions, and I'll just complete. On one side, there is a Hindu right who recognizes this. Those who recognize this, they are into Ghar Wapsi program, because they look at Muslims as misled people, who their forlorn brothers who were somehow or other deceived and were kind of tricked into some other religion, or have become non-vegetarian, doing all kinds of violent things and all that stuff of it. You come back. And that is all the Ghar Wapsi project. But then there are, of course, Hindus, such as Savarkar and others, who say that no, this is essentially a Hindu land, and everybody has to, and these are all outsiders. Hindus and Christians are outsiders, and they have to be treated as outsiders in this Hindu land. So Savarkar, in his controversial book called Glorious Epochs of Indian History, justifies that rape should be used as a method to take revenge. And so he has this sentence where he says, but it is not strange that neither Shivaji Maharaj nor Chimaji Appa should ever remember the atrocities and the rapes and the molestations perpetrated by Mahmud Ghazni, Mahmud Ghori, Alauddin Khilji, and others, or thousands of Hindu ladies and girls. The souls of those millions of aggrieved women might have perhaps said, do not forget, O Your Majesty Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, and O Your Excellency Chimaji Appa, the unutterable atrocities and oppression and outrage committed on us by the sultans and Muslim noblemen and thousands of others, big and small. Let the sultans and their peers, he suggests, take a place that in the event of Hindu victory, our molestation, detestable lot shall be avenged on Muslim women. Once they are hunted with this dreadful apprehension that Muslim women too stand in the same predicament in case of Hindus win, the future Muslim conquerors will never dare to think of such molestation of Hindu women. So he recommends that rape should have happened about it. Now let me just complete here, because for lack of time. So then one begins to ask that the Hindu right is not adequately certain that what should be particularly the approach about this. So how should we interpret Ghar Wapsi? Is it an attempt to forgive and welcome them back? Then if you want to welcome them back, then Hinduism being a 4-storied house without staircase, where would you place them? You have a 4-caste system, and you have all these people who come back. And where would you place Mujibur Rahman, who wants to be Brahmin or something? So we are kind of lost over there. So let me just now conclude by saying this. But this notion of revenge certainly kind of constitutes the DNA of Hindu right ideology. And though there is a recognition that, which is the reason why Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, who is the philosophical guru of our Prime Minister, talked about purification of Muslims. because he wants essentially to be, you should be compatible to us about of it. Let me conclude with this, and then I'll come back in the question asked. Thank you.
Okay, I will invite now Monsieur Carpentier de Bourdon. We talk about taking revenge or making justice.
Thank you, Sylvia. My thanks to Ramin and to the organizers and to the IIC and Jindal University. When you speak after a few predecessors, you obviously try not to repeat what has been said, so that brings about some evolution in your own plan, you might say, for the way to cover the subject matter. And first, I'd like to make a few comments about revenge, forgiveness, from an etymological point of view, because etymology, etymos in Greek is utama in Sanskrit, so the highest. And we know that it's intimately both revenge and forgiveness are tied to four fundamental notions and four fundamental principles in society, which are, at least four, which are justice, law, religion, and spirituality. And of course, within these four parameters, you can situate both forgiveness and revenge, because revenge is a very ambiguous thing. You see, revenge comes from vindicare in Latin, and vindicare is also essentially, as was said by a previous speaker, paying back. When we say somebody is vindicated, essentially it means that he is given a revenge either by other people or by nature, by God, by the law of things, by essentially the way that reality works. And therefore, it is very commercial as a concept. In fact, there is an element of buying and selling, see, and as opposed to gift, which was, as Sylvia has pointed out, is forgiveness. So essentially, by giving, you get out of the transactional relationship in which you have to pay a price for everything, or if you have something that people want, you have to get something in return. And that, of course, takes us back to the initial concept of sin, which in primitive or early societies was not separate from crime or misdeed. Sin in Greek is ophelimata, which is essentially a debt. So whenever you are in debt, you have contracted a sin. And that should be very relevant to our modern societies, which have gone into debt to the tune of $60 trillion for the world at large, which shows how sinful we are. But back to the notion of revenge and forgiveness, it's very interesting that justice probably arose as a regulatory principle for revenge and implicitly for forgiveness too, because justice is a very controversial and subjective notion. What is just? What is fair? Obviously, revenge tends to be disproportionate. If you leave people to themselves, they'll probably inflict greater harm than what has been inflicted upon them out of hatred for the persons who aggrieved them. Therefore, by a code of justice, by law, you restrict revenge to the equivalent of what was done to you. That's a notion, you find that in Gudea and in Hammurabi's codes, and you find it in the law of Talion, that if somebody takes out an eye, don't take his two eyes, take only one. It still doesn't mean that you will not make everybody blind in the end, but you try to inflict some proportionality. And also, another very important concept, you take as much as possible justice away from the hands of the aggrieved party, in the sense you don't do justice to yourself. You have somebody else, you have the state or a religious organization, or even you might say a parastatal body like the mafia, like the Heilige Wärme in medieval Germany, that essentially carries out punishment and retribution. And it does it as a third party. Because obviously, if people carry out their own revenge, it will be practically impossible to stop retribution again, and you end up in societies which are ruled by the code of vendetta, which we know in the Mediterranean region. Vendetta again means revenge, vindicta, and it means that people can keep fighting between families for centuries. And the same reality applies to states, which have kept fighting for hundreds of years because of real or imaginary wrongs that were committed very long ago. Look at the animosity between Arabs and Iranians, which is rooted, at least symbolically, in the conflict between the family of Ali and Muawiyah's clan. You see there a clear case of perpetuation of a grievance. And again, there the question is, what is justice? And also, has it done any good to keep the memory of that grievance? Because we speak a lot about memory today and about the need to constantly keep the memory alive, and I'm referring to a particular case. But then again, is the memory always such a good thing? I mean, sometimes, there is a Christian saying, I'm sure it goes beyond Christianity, which is, when I forgive, I forget. Because if you don't forget, you cannot forgive. It's like, keeping saying, well, I know what you did to me, and I'm not going to talk about it now, but it's there, and by the way, here is the bill. And you will keep presenting the bill for generations to come, which is being done even today. But, then again, you have the issue of, is justice just in that case? Because it means that anybody who is pressing more than others for vindication will probably get it. And there is a law of balance which should apply universally, and it doesn't, simply because some communities are more powerful and can impress their grievances more effectively than others. I mean, you can compare the Tibetans and the Palestinians, or the Jews and the Indians who were uprooted from Pakistan, etc., etc. So you will see there that there are lots of considerations which are purely subjective, which are phenomenal, which come from specific circumstances, and which cannot be given universal applicability. Now, that, of course, takes us to, again, the notion of forgiveness within justice. Because it's very clear that anybody who forgives is only credible if he has the power to punish. Somebody who has no power to punish has no merit in forgiving, simply because he has probably very few recourses. You see, let's put it this way. The poor landless man who forgives the Lord, who has taken his house away from him, cannot be said to be necessarily magnanimous. It's probably good for him if he forgives, because he can carry on with life and do something else, rather than trying to take revenge for in any way possible. On the other hand, the person who has the power and who forgives, that is magnanimous, and that is real forgiveness. Therefore, there is here very much a consideration of, when Tolstoy and Gandhi were considering the concept of forgiveness, they were essentially, Tolstoy was speaking as a very privileged man. Gandhi, not so much, obviously, especially in his youth, but he also felt that even though the Indians apparently had little power against the British Raj, there was still that need to embody and carry forgiveness in their actions, simply because it would be self-destructive to carry out the struggle for liberation with a spirit of revenge. And here, of course, you can see a difference between certain religious cultures. I find it very difficult to talk about religion without essentially impinging upon literature, which has been dealt with in the previous session. But religion, of course, expresses itself in a lot of literature, sacred and profane. And it's true that, for example, if you look at the history of the Jewish religion, you realize that, as one of my Jewish intellectual friends says, we have no redemption in Judaism. There is no concept of redemption. In other words, you have to get the price for what was done to you, basically. And everybody, therefore, has to have this sense of getting accounts settled. Now, there is a very powerful illustration of that in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, where Shylock keeps insisting for justice and refuses any kind of compensation other than what he wants, which is what was agreed upon legally. And of course, that legalistic emphasis leads, of course, to his eventual discomfiture, because he lives in a society which, even though it may be seen as unfair to minorities, still believes that there is a higher precept than the mere exaction of a compensation. And you can find the same, but in a much higher perspective in The Tempest. The Tempest, Shakespeare's Tempest, is a very powerful illustration of how a drama which in the beginning appears to be political, ruled by Machiavellian realpolitik, is transcended by a metaphysical and philosophical discovery or illumination which belongs to an imaginary world, but then this imaginary world becomes real, because you realize that all this politicking and all this talk about getting what one wants and paying a price for it, all that is essentially illusory. You rise above that and you just discard this world of machinations on politicking. And that is something probably a bit similar to what you find in the Bhagavad Gita when Krishna tells Arjuna, do your duty, fight since you have to according to the dharma of your varna, but remember that all this is make-believe. Remember that all the people who have to die are already dead, and those who have to live will also die, but not now. So it's just a matter of time setting. Now that can give a very, of course, relativistic vision, but again, the world is relativistic, a relativistic vision of the perspective of forgiveness versus justice. You see, in Italy, the Ministry of Justice, because Italy was founded on a Catholic foundation, a Catholic principle, it's called the Ministry of Grace and Justice, because the notion of grace or forgiveness is supposed to precede, or at least to instill, the exercise of justice. And likewise, in Islam, we have Rahima as the very essence of God's justice. You often talk in various religions about the two faces of God. The justice, which is wrathful because it is stern and unforgiving, and you have the pleasant, soft, sweet, merciful side, and the two are supposed to complement each other. And you find that very early in the Bible when you have this famous ceremony performed by the people of the covenant, the 12 tribes, when 6 went on Mount Gerizim and 6 went on Mount Hebal, and some were pronounced as curses and others pronounced as benedictions, to show that there were these two sides of God, the blessing on the one side and the punishment on the other. And that, of course, tells us that justice provides what you might call vindication, but again, not revenge, because it's a collective punishment. It's not something that is done privately by somebody on somebody else, as opposed to, of course, the actual exercise of revenge by an individual against another, which leads, when there is no monopoly of violence in the hands of the state, which leads to endless strife. That, of course, would tell us that human justice is never perfect. In fact, it probably is never fully accomplished. And therefore, every religion puts the ultimate justice in the hands of the gods, or even more subtly, in the hands of a cosmic mechanism, karma, which means that if you don't have only one life to expiate, then there are other lives that will essentially reward you, both for good and for evil. In a sense, you see, the way we execute or we pronounce justice very much depends upon our concept of the human being and of beings in general. Is the human being a soul? Is the soul immortal? Is there no soul? Is it only a body? If it's only a body, then obviously you feel that the body is everything there is, and it becomes very problematic to punish the body. That's why the death penalty becomes unacceptable. If you want to punish the body or even to kill the body to save the soul, that has another kind of justification. If there is no soul, as in the Buddhist perspective, but there is only a temporary concatenation or agglomeration of factors, of samskars, then who do you punish? I mean, there is that famous line in Shobogenzo of Dogen who says, I sat by the river and I saw the river flowing, And it was always the same river. It was motionless, but yet the water was not the same from one second to the next. The same is true of a human being. What is a human being if 1 hour later, 1 year later, he still has the same shape, more or less, but he may not have the same components? So then again, how do you punish? You see, in that case. And do you punish only as a retribution, or do you punish for rehabilitation, or for setting an example? I would conclude by saying that religions obviously have to balance their social and their mystical functions. The judicial, social aspect of religion has to ensure some sort of justice, which implies punishment. But there is a mystical side, the transcending side, Sufism, mysticism in Christianity, the Bhakta movement in India, which tells you to go above and to forsake willful and selfish revenge, because it is not in your hands and you will only harm yourself. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, you see that revenge ranks quite low, second, third level, which are essentially the need for social acceptance and honor. You know, what we justifies even honor killings. You know, I want society to accept me as a respected human being, therefore I take my revenge and I punish those who did harm to me. But much above, at the transcendent level, you have number 7 and number 8, you have forgiveness, because that essentially is what detaches you from the endless cycle of life and death. That's what takes you beyond. And just briefly, 2 or 3 examples in literature. I already quoted Shakespeare, but in the 19th century, there were, of course, some great novelists in Russia, in Britain, in France, who talked about revenge and forgiveness. And there are 2 famous ones in France. One is Dumas, when he wrote The Count of Monte Cristo, which was one of the most read books in his lifetime. The Count of Monte Cristo is about revenge. And Dumas had a problem trying to justify it, so in the end he shows Monte Cristo essentially running away and forgiving his last victim, because he realizes that he has rightly punished people who did terrible wrong, but then he realizes that happiness does not lie there, and whatever perverse joy he got in doing it is gone. And as Dumas had problems with the church, he himself was a non-believer, but the church did not accept novels that extolled revenge. And Jules Verne, who was his younger contemporary, was himself not necessarily very Christian, but he was made to write Christian stuff by his publisher, Hetzel, who was interestingly a Jew, but who insisted that there should be strict Catholic standards. And Jules Verne, when he wanted to write another Count of Monte Cristo, because it was a phenomenally successful theme, he wrote a novel called Matthias Sandorf. And Matthias Sandorf is also about revenge, but of course, he said, no, it's not about revenge, it's about doing justice, or making justice. So essentially, the hero does about the same that Monte Cristo did to the people who hurt him, but he says, I'm just carrying out justice because society will not do it for me. Then the question is, of course, if society is not able or not willing to do justice, should then somebody be willing and able to do it? And I think that's, of course, a very problematic issue, and normally societies deny that. They say you cannot take the law into your own hands, but we all know that throughout history this has been done. So I leave it there by saying that religions have been generally ineffective tools to try to limit the exercise of revenge, while allowing it or legitimating it in certain circumstances. And more than anything, almost all religions have taught the importance and the salutary value of forgiveness. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, where to start for commenting? Okay, for instance, in the field of revenge, we haven't to resort to Dumas or to others, but just seeing what's on, like the cinema now. So we need somehow to feel like, having these topics treated, because it gives us satisfaction simply. So this idea of revenge or having our wrong resolved is something very human, and what exactly we need to talk about, some very humbly, and okay, from a religious point of view, but at the same time understand that how we interpret religion and the text and our cultural tradition and all the archetypes we have, from Greek tradition, and the idea of the heroes, how to bear pain, and so on. So we have to understand how we can regain our spirituality somehow, our individual relation with the religion, and resort and detach from every kind of probably collective and communal kind of activism in resorting by religion, because if you think about monotheism, they give us the perfect justification for endless violence. If we think about the punitive God of the Hebraic tradition, Mas talk about that, or the Islamic or the Hinduist, we feel that the threat is very tangible, and sometimes even not understanding what's going on the underground gives us, makes us surprising, for instance, of what happened during the 9/11, no? So it's like something, you feel surprised about what kind of violence, that kind of violence was even interpreted by some psychologists as a punitive violence, like, in the resorting to a sort of like pride that must be corrected somehow. So I want just to, before leaving you, the floor to the question, I want just to add some commentaries about the Catholic tradition. Catholicism and the Christian, the Pope, the Church, they are trying since the 60s to change the language, to detach from that punitive God that is in the ancient Testament. And for instance, there was this, was thinking about the idea of punishment for the sins, no? There was this Dominican monk who was saying that one of the southern city, Messina in Sicily, was punished during a sort of earthquake because of the sin of the cities, and this was, lived by the church people like a sort of unthinkable thing, while for centuries that was the interpretation of punishment, of sin. And so from the 60s onward, with Paul VI, with Benedict, with John Paul II, all the encyclicals helped to rediscover this idea of the ego relational and not the ego violent. So this idea of ego violent is the one that we can see by resorting to that kind of interpretation, because it's a matter of interpretation always. And I think that we have to rediscover this our spiritual and divine, if we think there is one, a divine nature. And this is what probably can explain, for instance, even what the philosophers said. If I think about Hegel in the Phenomenology of the Spirit say that the absolute spirit emerges exactly when forgiveness is given. Forgiveness is there. When you recognize that we are all together, if you make something wrong, I will be involved, because probably even connecting this discourse with Levy's idea that some bad thing, some pain is introduced into the world, so we are all involved. So I will leave you the floor for some questions, and please, where is the microphone?
Modern India where we live, right? Even if they were foreigners, imagine, somebody who, most Mughal rulers married Indian women, Rajput women and all that stuff of it. And obviously their descendants were Indians by that logic, because their mother is Indian. By the same logic that, Rahul Gandhi could claim that he is Indian. So, we can play around all that stuff of it. The fact remains that there are a lot of things that happen in our history which are controversial, which have legacies, which have consequences. Now, we have to make up our mind that as a nation state, as a society, in which direction we want to move. We want to blame Mujibur Rahman for everything that Babur did or Aurangzeb did is certainly a very stupid idea. And that's where a lot of problem comes about it. Because I didn't consent either Aurangzeb or Babur to do anything about that kind of it. So we have to draw that distinction about it. So that's how far I would go about it. So thank you.
Now, there was one question and a comment. Regarding the question, I think forgiveness cannot be enjoined and prescribed by law. It's a feeling, it's a decision, and therefore it has to be left to the individual or to the community. And if you can't force forgiveness, you can at least force or at least you can induce or bring about the decision not to retaliate and to let bygones be bygones. And that's what has happened throughout human history. I mean, people have been killing each other from the beginning of time. You know, some anthropologists have done a study of the very early stages of humanity and found that the level of killing was much higher than it is now, or that it was, say, in the 17th century. Therefore, this whole idea that somehow the 20th century invented barbarity and that what happened during World War II was never seen before, it's wrong. I mean, if you only have to look at the massacres committed by Genghis Khan or Tamerlane, and you can go on and on with the Romans, and you will find that, and the Chinese who lost millions of people in their civil wars, you find that barbarity has been a constant feature of the human civilization. Therefore, it's completely impossible to require forgiveness, but just like you cannot compel people to love each other. You can say, love each other, which is just a sage advice. Beyond that, you leave it to them to try to at least accommodate each other and tolerate each other. And if they can do better, good for them, but it's not in the hands of the law of the state. And you, for example, see that the Decalogue says, "Thou shalt not kill." But then the Catholic Church realized that this had never been followed in practice and could probably never be. So they said, all right, "Thou shalt not kill" without any valid reason for it, which is a church commandment. Why? Because they realized that telling people not to kill each other is basically, well, it works, fortunately, quite a few times, but there are times when it will not work. And then you can say, all right, then we failed, then let's give it up altogether. Like in America, the National Rifle Association says, no, it's okay, we want guns and we'll shoot anybody we like. There's no point preventing us because that's our nature. We are Americans and we have a right to use our guns. Now, regarding what Ramin said, yes, there is a very interesting notion of fate in Greece, ananke or moire, which of course makes the whole thing completely irrational, because if people do things because even they were forced to do it by fate, then you can't punish them because they are not responsible. I think many of our leftist intellectuals have come to the same conclusion, that since society is responsible for everything, nobody is guilty of anything, basically, which means you don't punish them, and of course that leads to another kind of excess, right? On the other hand, it's true that I think, you can take two of the interpretations. Kapila Vatsyayan left 5 minutes ago, but I was going to tell her that you can take either one of the two interpretations. Either the Greeks were part of the larger Indo-European stream and they lost the notion of reincarnation and karma, which means they were left with a rather blind moire. Or the notion of karma as a scientific explanation across lives was developed in India and in some other places. And that was essentially gave some rationale, some logic. Because obviously then you realize that if something happened in previous states of existence, then there is something to be paid for. And then it makes sense, it's logical. And you know that likewise, if you pay your bills now, you will reap the rewards in your next life. Otherwise, of course, if you are left to the mercy of blind fate, then it's a fairly despairing situation.
Okay, thank you very much to our panelists. Very interesting interventions, rich. So we have plenty of reasons and topics for reasoning and thinking. So thank you. And if you have any other question, I don't know, there should be a sort of price. Okay, any other question during the coffee break? Okay, so thank you very much.